Recently, there was an episode of The Watchmen on HBO, and it hit social media like a bullet. I mean, people were talking about this show in a way that I really could not have anticipated, partly because of the fact that the first episode was so strong. And admittedly, I wasn't too big on the Watchmen TV show because I thought, well, it's not going to be as good as the comic book, and why won't they just let this property live as a comic book? And Alan Moore has repetitively said that he does not want this to be turned into a movie or a TV show or anything, but people will not just let him rest. But I was really intrigued by the first episode. The first episode of the show features one of America's darkest chapters, which is the Oklahoma race riots. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that they had put something like that on mainstream television. I mean, the Oklahoma race riots was something that, it was just so dark and so horrific. I couldn't believe that they actually showed that on TV. It was something that I had only really recently heard about myself, and so the idea that it was just put onto TV in front of millions of people's faces, it was wild to me. And the response on social media was just so huge. I mean, I was really shocked by how many people were talking about it. How many people, particularly white people, had never heard of this story before, of this true story. I mean, this isn't past 1,000 years ago or something like that. Like, this happened fairly recently, in fairly recent memory, and so many people had never heard of it. So I wanted to make a video about it, talking a little bit more about the events of this horrific night. And yeah. What do we think of when we think of America? Do we think of equality, justice, liberty for all? Do we think of the millions of people killed, all in the pursuit of white supremacy? These things are also a part of American history, and while they are dark and horrific, we do no justice to the victims by letting these terrors be forgotten by the past. Passed by Congress on January 31st, 1865, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The promises that were made by then-President Abraham Lincoln that each slave would get 40 acres and a mule to rebuild their lives were crushed by his assassination. With this, millions of displaced Africans had to build their lives in the shadow of a devastated post-Civil War America. For many former slaves, this meant staying on the land that enslaved them, and working as sharecroppers, which was essentially indentured servitude, where they rented the land for the right to work on it. But for many, this time was a time to leave the land where so many of their family members had been beaten, killed, raped, and kidnapped, the cursed land that caused so much misery, to a new, unmarred county. Oklahoma declared statehood in 1907, years after the Indian Appropriations Act of 1851, in which the United States government set aside funds to remove native populations from the state onto reservations. This removal of people from their ancestral land by often violent acts turned Oklahoma into a land soaked by suffering. This state was settled by many Southern slaveholders, and shortly passed racial segregation laws that prevented blacks from voting, from serving on juries, or running for office. In 1916, Tulsa passed an ordinance forbidding blacks and whites from residing on any block where 3/4 or more of the people on the block were of another race, thus making racial segregation the law of the land. Although the Supreme Court ruled the law unconstitutional in 1917, it remained on the books until the 1960s. After 1918, post-World War I, most veterans were returning from war, and black veterans, rightly so, felt as though their service in the military earned them rights in their home country. Many industrial cities across the U.S. had outbreaks of recently immigrated whites lashing out violently at blacks. These whites viewed the blacks as competition for jobs and were openly violent, and even when black people would defend themselves, they were largely outnumbered. In northern Oklahoma, there was an economic slump that put many men out of work. This coincided with the swelling numbers of the local KKK that drew in many urban areas, especially after veterans came back from the war. By the end of 1921, the Tulsa KKK had 3,200 members and a population of 72,000. White men were out of work and needed a scapegoat for their economic misery. Because of segregation laws, discrimination against blacks shopping in white-owned stores, going to hospitals, owning businesses, or receiving any sort of specialized service, like dentistry, carpentry, or barbers, black people had begun creating their own businesses and their own industries. One example was the thriving neighborhood of Greenwood in Tulsa. They had several grocery stores, 2 independent newspapers, 2 movie theaters, many nightclubs, and churches. People from the community were chosen as leaders, and there was a working capital in town. And due to the local oil boom, many blacks in the area enjoyed economic prosperity. The nickname that was given was a well-deserved one. It was called the Negro Wall Street. This economic prosperity was unique to the black residents of this town, built up out of necessity and hard work, literally from nothing. The surrounding white areas of Tulsa, although, did not share this amount of good fortune. Monday, May 30th, 1921, Memorial Day. 19-year-old Dick Rowland, a black shoeshine employee, riding the elevator to the bathroom in the nearby Drexel building, had an encounter with Sarah Page, the 17-year-old white elevator attendant. A clerk in the building reportedly heard a girl scream and saw a young black man rushing from the building. Assuming that she had survived a sexual attack by Rowland, he called the authorities, although an official account was never made by the girl. There was a small investigation of which no official statement by Page has ever surfaced. It is generally believed that this was not an assault, but something else, with Page never wanting to press charges. The next day, a patrolman detained Rowland and brought him to the Tulsa City Jail when a threatening phone call was made against his life by an anonymous person. It was decided he should be moved to the top floor of the Tulsa County Courthouse. The Tulsa Tribune was the first to break the story under the incendiary headline, quote, "Nab Negro for attacking girl in an elevator." It should be noted, additionally, between the Declaration of Statehood in 1907 and the Tulsa Race Riot 13 years later, 31 persons were lynched in Oklahoma. 26 of them were black, and nearly all of them were men or boys. Very few of these crimes have ever had any sort of persons held accountable for them. These crimes were motivated primarily by 2 reasons. One was to discourage economic competition. The best way that racist whites thought to get rid of blacks making more money from you or those that were opening up competitive businesses was just to kill them. And the other reason was a supposed attraction between the races. If you had a white daughter or wife and thought that a black male was sexually attracted to them, the quickest way to solve that insecurity was just to have him killed as well. Sexual insecurity by white men against black men is nothing new. The fear that black men have more sexual prowess led to many deaths during this time, and, to a large degree, continue to this day. According to witnesses, there was also a warning in the newspaper about a potential lynching. Quote, "To lynch Negro tonight," it was reported. All copies of that newspaper have mysteriously been destroyed, and the relevant part of the newspaper is missing from the microfilm record. By 7:34 p.m. that night, a white mob had assembled of several hundred people, which was feared to be the beginning of a lynch mob. 3 white men entered the courthouse demanding that Roland be turned over to them. The sheriff turned them away, shut off the elevators in the building, and put gunmen on the roof. Black members of the community gathered to decide what to do. Veterans wanted to arm themselves to defend Roland from the lynch mob. Business owners and families were concerned about the potential destruction and damage. One can only imagine what was going through Roland's mind. He was a young boy locked up in a cell, unsure of what his crime even was, unsure of what was happening outside. He must have known someone who had been the victim of a lynching, maybe even stumbled across a body himself. The terror he must have felt of what would happen to him is unknowable. A group of armed black men showed up at the courthouse to help support the sheriff and his men protect Roland. Seeing the armed black men, some 1,000 whites, went home for their guns, others went to the National Guard armory to try and steal weapons. By this time, the crowd had swelled to over 2,000 white people. A second group of about 75 armed black men arrived at the courthouse. A fear from the whites of a, quote, Negro uprising made the rumor of a standoff even more tense. Gunshots were fired into the air, to which the white mob responded by shooting indiscriminately into the crowd. Gunfire was returned. The white mob chased the blacks towards Greenwood, looting and robbing local stores as they pursued. A riot had officially broken out. Many prominent Tulsa whites also participated in the riot, including Tulsa founder and KKK member W. Tate Brady, who participated in the riot as a night watchman. He reported seeing, quote, 5 dead Negroes, including one man who was dragged behind a car by a noose around his neck. At around 1 a.m., fires began. White people began setting businesses on fire. When the fire department came to put them out, the whites turned them away at gunpoint. By 4 a.m., 24 black-owned businesses had burned to the ground. Many people began to flee from Greenwood at this time. Gunfire was heard from all around the neighborhood. It sounded like it was surrounding them, keeping them trapped by the fires. The crowds of whites stormed Greenwood, shooting indiscriminately. People ran terrorized for their lives, splitting into smaller groups. White people would break into homes and residencies, looting, killing, and destroying people's homes. 6 biplane 2-seater trainer planes left over from World War I were dispatched from the nearby Curtis Southwest field outside Tulsa. Many residents of Greenwood reported snipers firing on them from the planes and firebombs being dropped on their buildings and shelters. Law enforcement officials later stated that the planes were to provide reconnaissance and to protect from a Negro uprising. Several groups of black attempted to organize a defense, but they were overwhelmed by the number of armed whites. Many blacks surrendered. Others returned fire and ultimately were killed. As the fire spread northward through Greenwood, countless black families continued to flee. Many were estimated to have died while trapped by the flames in their homes. Quite simply, it was a massacre. In other parts of the city's more middle-class neighborhoods, whites who employed black people as domestic servants were ordered to turn them over to the white mobs. Most complied. Those that didn't suffered vandalizing to their properties. Wednesday, June 1st, 1921, 9:15 a.m. The Oklahoma National Guard arrived with 109 troops from Oklahoma City by special train. Ordered in by the governor, they could not legally act until they had contacted all the appropriate local authorities, including the mayor, T.D. Evans, the sheriff, and the police chief. While they waited, thousands of black people lay dead, terrorized, rounded up, and were badly wounded. The troops spent the time having breakfast. Thousands of surviving black citizens had fled the city. Under the martial law that was enacted in the city, another 4,000 persons had been rounded up and detained at various centers. By noon, the troops had managed to suppress most of the remaining violence. A 1921 letter from an officer of the service company, 3rd Infantry, Oklahoma National Guard, who arrived at May 31st, reported numerous events related to suppression of the riot. 1. Taking about 30 or 40 African Americans into custody. 2. Putting a machine gun on a truck and taking it on patrol. 3. Being fired on by black snipers from the church and returning fire. 4. Being fired on by white men. 5. Turning the prisoners over to deputies to take them to police headquarters. 6. Being fired upon by blacks and having 2 NCOs slightly wounded. 7. Searching for blacks and firearms. 8. detailing an NCO to take 170 blacks to the civil authorities, and 9 delivering an additional 150 Negroes to the convention hall. Dear listener, I hope that you are noticing that all of the people that are being detained, arrested, and imprisoned are black. Moving on. Because of the fact that both of the black hospitals had been burned to the ground, the only people who were able to be treated for their wounds were Tulsa's white citizens. Even if the local hospitals ended their segregation policy, many black residents wouldn't have been able to get to these hospitals without risking further injury. More than 6,000 black Greenwood residents were arrested and detained at 3 local facilities: Convention Hall, now known as Brady Theater, the Fairgrounds, then located about a mile northeast of Greenwood, and McNulty Park, a baseball stadium at 10th Street and Elgin Avenue. There is no record of any white people being arrested for any crime. Several black people were known to have died while in the internment centers. While most of the deaths were said to have been accurately recorded, no records have been found as to how many detainees were treated for injuries. These numbers could reasonably have been more than 1,000, perhaps several thousand. The commercial sector of Greenwood was destroyed. Losses include 191 businesses, a junior high school, several churches, and the only hospital in the district. The Red Cross reported that 1,256 houses were burned and another 215 were looted but not burned. The Tulsa Real Estate Exchange estimated property losses amounted to $1.5 million in real estate and about $750,000 in personal property. In 2018, that's estimated to be about $31 million. The Red Cross estimated that 10,000 people, mostly black, were made homeless by the destruction. The Red Cross, in their preliminary overview, mentioned wide-ranging external estimates of either 55 to 300 dead. However, due to the hurried nature of the undocumented burials, declined to suggest an estimate of their own, stating, quote, "The number of dead is a matter of conjecture." The Red Cross registered 183 people were hospitalized, mostly for gunshot wounds or burns. They differentiate in their records on the basis of triage category, not the type of wound. While a further 531 required first aid or surgical treatment. 8 miscarriages were attributed to be the result of the tragedy. 19 died in care. At the same year, State Attorney General S.P. Freeling initiated an investigation, and witnesses were heard over 12 days. In the end, the surprisingly but not surprising all-white jury attributed the riot to the black community, while noting that the law enforcement officials had failed in preventing the riot. The horrors of this event reverberate continuously to this day. It was only in 2001 that any acknowledgement of the deaths and destructions that was committed unto the black citizens of Greenwood ever happened. The survivors, of whom the youngest was 85 at the time, were denied any sort of reparations from their terror, but instead given medals. Medals to commemorate the worst event in their entire lives. In 2015, a new eyewitness account from May 31, 1921 was discovered and obtained by the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. This report was from a black citizen of Oklahoma, attorney Buck Colbert Franklin, accounting while watching planes circling in midair. Quote, "They grew in number and hummed, darted, and dipped low. I could hear something like hail falling upon the top of my office building. Down East Archer, I saw the old Midway Hotel on fire, burning from its top, and then another and another and another building began to burn from their top. Lurid flames roared and belched and licked their forked tongues into the air. Smoke ascended the sky in thick black volumes, and amid it all, the planes, now a dozen or more in number, still hummed and darted here and there with the agility of natural birds in the air. The skywalks were literally covered with burning turpentine balls. I knew all too well where they came from, and I knew all too well why every burning building caught fire from the top. I paused and waited for an opportune time to escape. Where, oh where, is our splendid fire department with its half-dozen stations? I asked myself. Is the city in conspiracy with the mob? So that's all for tonight's episode, and wow. This one took me so long to make for obvious reasons. I mean, good God. I first said I was going to release this. I wrote this right after I saw the Watchmen episode, and I said I was going to release it right after that. And then that time had passed, and I said I was going to release it in Black History Month, and that time passed because every single time I would open up this document, I just stared at the words. I couldn't even say these things out loud. It was just so hard for me. It was so hard for me to even talk about these things, and I feel like such a coward because the least I could do was tell this story, you know? The least I could do was just talk about it. I didn't have to go through it. I didn't have to watch video. All I had to do was just tell the story. And I found it hard to do, so hard that I put this off for months and months and months. And quite frankly, I feel bad about that. So I'm going to take a break from these sorts of stories. I know that I said I was going to also do another story about executions, which is upcoming. I have it written. It's just also another one that, like, is just so hard for me to do. After I make that one, I'm gonna make videos, I think, about, like, fun stuff, maybe, like, take a break from writing videos about, like, child killings and serial killers. I think I'm just gonna make some videos about ghosts and UFOs and Bigfoot, maybe, for a while, just to cleanse my palate. This one was really hard, and I regret not being able to do this faster, but it's out now, so. Alright. Thank you so much for listening. You can also follow me on Twitter and Instagram. I am Nocturnal Emissions, NOCEMISS on Twitter, and Nocturnal Emissions on Instagram. I hope to talk to you soon, and remember, stay spooky.